Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Margaret McManaway. I'm the Senior Associate Director at the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture, and I'm delighted that you've joined us today for our lunch lecture with Professor John Evans. For those of you who may not be familiar with our work, the mission of the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture is to share the richness of the Catholic moral and intellectual tradition through teaching, research, and engagement at the highest level and across a range of disciplines. Through our academic research and publications, our Soren Fellow Student Formation Program, our work to support a culture of life, and our efforts to assist the university in its efforts to attract and retain excellent scholars with a passion for Notre Dame's distinctive mission, we grapple with some of the most vexed questions of ethics, culture, and public policy today, and help project Notre Dame's distinctive voice into the public square on issues relating to justice, human dignity, and the common good. The DeNicola Center has historically been particularly interested in questions relating to bioethics, which is why we're particularly delighted to welcome today's speaker, John Evans, who will help us consider the questions surrounding some of the latest biotechnical advances in modern science, the questions they raise about what it means to be human, and our response to the development of such technologies. Professor Evans is the Tata Chancellor's Chair in Social Sciences, Associate Dean of Social Sciences, and co-director of the Institute for Practical Ethics at the University of California, San Diego. He has been a visiting member at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, a postdoctoral fellow at Yale University, and has held visiting professorial fellowships or honorary professorships at the universities of Edinburgh, Munster, Ben Gurion, and Queensland. He is the author of 7 books and 65 articles and book chapters. His latest book, Disembodied Brains, Understanding Our Intuitions on Human-Animal Neurochimeras and Human Brain Organoids, was released earlier this year through Oxford University Press. And I know we have some copies for our Soren Fellows if you didn't get a chance to grab one before the talk. Professor Evans has been elected to the honorific societies of 3 academic areas to which he contributes. He's a fellow of the Hastings Center, a fellow of the International Society for Science and Religion, and a member of the Sociological Research Association. He has focused his research on a number of overlapping areas, all of which concern the foundational humanistic questions behind science and technological development. Today, Professor Evans will speak to us about the ethics of human brain organoids and human-animal neural chimeras among U.S. bioethicists and the public. Please join me in welcoming Professor John Evans.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. It's great to be back at Notre Dame. I was trying to remember the last time I was here in bodily form. I believe it was something like 2004, and someone asked me if the campus has changed, and I don't remember, I'm afraid to say. But so happy to see that you bought some of my books. I mean, for those of you familiar with academic publishing, I probably make 70 cents off of each one of those, and now my entire profits are probably in like the $120 range, you know? So needless to say, we don't do this, for the money. So again, thank you very much for having me here. So I want to start by saying, some disclaimers. I'm not a scientist. I rely upon scientific colleagues to tell me what's possible. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not a theologian. I'm actually a sociologist with just enough knowledge of philosophy and theology to be dangerous. Most of my research projects involve discourse analysis of interviews, archival analysis, or quantitative analysis of surveys. This is going to be based pretty heavily on a survey today. And here's what I'm going to talk about, which I know seems like a lot, but some of it goes faster or slower. You can look at that quickly. And since everyone's eating lunch and the sugar levels might change, if you doze off where you see orange, that's where I am. So check back in on the outline when you see orange. So what am I talking about? Let's start with human brain organoids. Human brain organoids are 3-dimensional assemblages of human neural cells grown in the laboratory from stem cells. Imagine, and this is how it's done, you take some cells from someone's hand, coax the cells into reverting to stem cells. These are the basic cells that all other cells are made from. You then coax those into thinking and organizing itself like it's a brain cell, and then they start proliferating. Okay? So what happens if you took cells from someone with a genetically derived neurological disease? You would end up with an organoid that has the genetics of that disease. Scientists have done this, for example, with autism, schizophrenia, various neurological degeneration disorders. These are small. They're currently 4 to 5 millimeters in diameter and residing in a petri dish. There's limitations on these becoming like full versions of your brains. They're not mini brains, okay? Limitations include there's no vascularization, so they can only grow to a certain size before the inside, the middle starts to die, okay? Most importantly, organoids are only from one part of the brain, and what you think of as your brain is like a symphony of communication between different parts of your brain. And perhaps even more importantly, anything like consciousness requires interaction with the environment, and these sit in a petri dish. However, things are getting more complex. People are working on the vascularization problem. It's anticipated that soon organoids will be able to grow larger and more complex. It also turns out that when you put organoids from different parts of the brain next to each other, they form links between themselves, creating something called an assembloid. They're also at the slightest hints of interaction. It turns out that these organoids emit electrical signals like you would if you connected one of you here in the room to an EEG machine. One experiment found that they emit electrical signals sort of like human fetuses in utero. And again, if someone wants to talk theological anthropology towards the end of this, that's the main reason I came to Notre Dame this week, and so I'm all primed and ready to go if you want to talk about that more. But another experiment attached an organoid to retinal cells, and when they shine light on the retinal cells, the organoid started responding differently electrically, suggesting some sort of experience. Another colleague has this robot that's like a spider-like thing, and he puts the organoid in the middle, and the signals from the organoid make the spider thing walk around the room, but there's no way to put information back to the organoid, so it can't learn anything. But needless to say, this is an area that's developing really fast. So let me put that on pause for a second. Let's turn to chimeras. A chimera is a non-human animal with human cells in it. The term chimera obviously comes from ancient mythology, which is full of not only animal-to-animal chimeras, like horses with wings, but human-animal chimeras. There are at present no centaurs, and reality is a bit less dramatic. There is a decades-long history of creating human-animal chimeras where the mix is not in the brain. For example, scientists have created pigs with human-like internal organs that could be transplanted to humans. This here is a picture of a humanized mouse, which is a mouse with a human immune system that's used in medical experiments. These have been around for decades. I'm going to talk about neural chimeras, okay? That means a non-human animal with human neural cells in it. And from my office on campus, I can look down at a building, and there's a bunch of rats with partly human brains that live in there. Okay, so this is currently happening. So, why in the world would you do such a thing? Why would you create these entities? So let's start with how to create them. So there's a number of ways to create a neurochimeric animal. One is you take an organoid and you implant it in a mouse. In one experiment, the mice got smarter, at least by mouse standards. I mean, none of them stood up and said, "Hi, I'm Mickey, mouse," But there's experiments for mouse intelligence having to do with like running around mazes and stuff, and they supposedly got smarter. It's anticipated that soon it'll be possible to use a technique that takes a mouse blastocyst, so like 200 cells that grow into a fetus and then a mouse. You destroy the cells in the blastocyst that would become the mouse brain, and you put human cells in there, and the mouse brain would then be partly made of human cells. If you can do that with a mouse, in theory, you could do it with a monkey, and experiments are underway with these sort of techniques, not in the United States, in non-human primates, I think mostly macaques. You could use genetic engineering to put human genes in the cells of a mouse. Now, the difference between these are not really important for my purposes today. They don't really have ethical relevance, so I'll kind of skip over that for now. But again, why would a mouse, like these rats that are down in a lab, you look at them and they just look like rats. Why? Rats and mice do not have speech, Secondly, you compare the size of the human skull and the mouse or rat skull, there's going to be differences no matter what. Third, mouse go from a blastocyst to an actual mouse in 25 days, and humans takes 9 months. A human brain cannot develop in 25 days, so no one knows what you would get if you tried to gestate part of a human brain inside of a mouse, okay? So this is obviously in the early stage. But as I said, research is underway in China on non-human primates, and we don't really know what's going on. Why do this? Well, so this is an ethical problem, which means there's two sides here. There's something to weigh. These are called human brain substitutes, is what they would say. The ethical reason is to conduct medical research to alleviate human suffering caused by neurological diseases and disorders. So why do we need this? As one scientist told me, it's a great time to be a mouse with Alzheimer's disease. In other words, there's all sorts of spectacular treatments that work really well in mice. So these mice with Alzheimer's, they're all being cured. But I guess even I know enough biology to think, I can imagine human and mice livers are kind of similar, but what makes us different from mice is really the brain. So lo and behold, a lot of these treatments don't work in humans. But if you're actually using human brain tissue, you can learn more about what to do. More importantly, how do you test anything on a human brain? Because all the live human brains are residing in live actual humans. If this was the 1940s, frankly, medical researchers would find poor people somewhere and just experiment on them without their permission. But one bit of progress in our society is that we don't do that anymore. And so therefore, this is live human brain tissue that's not in an actual human, and therefore we can ethically experiment on it to create cures for neurological diseases. Let me just put aside a whole range of more narrow ethical questions that have been brought up with this. Experimenting on animals in the first place, if that's your concern, you would have gotten off this train long, long ago. Another, what level of consent is required to grow an organoid from someone's abandoned tissue? Another big question. If you create a mouse that's as smart as a pig, do you have to treat it like they treat pigs? Because these different types of animals are treated differently in different laboratory contexts. And what are the evidentiary standards for societal safety? These are all important. I'm going to talk about something else today. I'll speed up, I promise. Whose ethics? I'm comparing the ethical views of professional ethicists with the public. And the reason for this, that at least the US ethicist views is what gets the most weight in setting actual policy. For example, the US government will consult with ethicists to decide whether it will fund neurochimeric research of various sorts. Since the professionals have this dominant voice, they're a useful comparison with the public. I'm also playing with a tension in the bioethics discipline, which is that in the US it claims to be the representative of the public between the scientists and the public, but in actuality, I would argue it typically represents its own views. So in case everyone in this room isn't aware, people with PhDs are very unusual compared to everybody else. Okay, you've trained in a particular way, and your norms and values are typically different. Okay, the rest of the talk is comparing the ethical concerns of the academic bioethical debate with that of the public. So how do I determine what the academics believe? This is easy. They write everything down, and they publish it, and it's available online. That's great. Okay, so that's simple for now. But the public. To determine the general public's ethics on these issues, I conducted 35 in-depth interviews with a stratified sample from the public in what is called a cognitive testing of the survey. The cognitive testing was used to build a nationally representative survey that uses an experimental vignette design, which I'll explain in a minute. With this design, I can make claims about what the public thinks. There are many details I'm going to skip over here, but bear with me. And at various points, there's this disreputable group of sociologists over here. I'll point to them, and they can make fun of me. So when doing research in an area that is not existing research, and there's not extensive discussion in the public, there's not one survey question that's going to give you some sort of exact answer. I'm always interested in these more abstract questions. If I wanted to ask someone, what are your feelings of your responsibility towards your aging parents? Everyone's talked about that. There's various ways of talking about that you can get to. These new issues like this, it's not so easy to do. So there'll be a number of tests, and I think at the end you will see my point. Okay, so what did I do? An experimental design vignette has a number of advantages when investigating ethical issues. The idea is to use randomization to avoid confounding factors. This is like a clinical trial. For a COVID vaccine trial, for example, we would worry that maybe the occupation of the people in the trial, or maybe their age or their race or whatever, that's what's really causing a better effectiveness than the vaccine itself. But we don't worry about that because we randomly assign people to either get the drug or not get the drug, okay? And therefore, the treatment or the control is not associated at all with any trait that the person has, okay? There's a reason why medical researchers use this, and I'm going to use it too. So the vignette survey design uses this logic. A vignette is a paragraph-long description of a survey where survey respondents are randomly assigned to see particular chunks of text, okay? At the end of the vignette, the respondent is asked something like, do you approve of this technology? Okay, so let me show you how this works. The first sentence of my vignette is, a human brain organoid is a, and then what you see in the box there, 50% of the sample was randomly assigned to see half an inch, and 50% of the people were assigned to see 5-inch, part of the human brain. Sorry, turn my phone here. And critically, they don't know that the other people in the survey were assigned to see the other option, okay? So they can't game their behavior to present a proper view of themselves to the researcher. Then the next line, I should say that there's a number of other features to this which I won't get into, but there's 64 possible descriptions the respondent could have seen. But in the end, this is what the survey people saw. When you see an underline part, they didn't see underline. The underline means that's one of those things that varied randomly, okay? So I'll let you read that a bit, and then I'll start talking. Like half the respondents saw it been created, half grown. I'm trying to get at this notion of human instrumentality there, okay? More importantly, for my case here, half the debate saw was whether or not this thing would obtain self-awareness. Half saw awareness of its surroundings, which is a debate in philosophy, which I'll skip over for now. And more importantly, is that final underlined thing. 1/4 of the people saw different versions of how much awareness this insect, how much awareness the organoid would have. Okay. So at the end of all of this, there was a question. Should research into human brain organoids continue? Okay. So the first basic question is, averaging across all of the possible things that they would have seen about what an organoid is, what do people think? So there is very strong support for this research among the public, okay? Now, obviously, one of the reasons that this exists like this is that I described it as potentially leading to the relief of suffering from neurological disease. And so it is an ethical debate, okay? So I also created a vignette for neurochimeras, which were described to the respondents as this. So I'll let you sort of look at that for a minute, but half the respondents saw subspecies. I was trying to get at the idea of like creating an entire new line of a life form versus like a couple of them. And then half saw monkey, half saw mouse. Okay, now you can sort of predict here what your difference is going to be in the response from the people who saw monkey or mouse, but I'll get into that in a minute. And then I'll get into the rest of these in a minute. these naming is important in a minute about what I decided to call these things. And right after this, I asked if they strongly disagree, agree, et cetera, with the statement, I support the creation of these chimeras. Okay. So the question is whether you get more agreement from people who are randomly assigned to see the different versions. So the people who are randomly assigned to see monkey, do we think that there's less support or more support? Less support. People they either like monkeys more or they think monkeys have more status. I don't have the ability to sense that, but that's just sort of an obvious, we call that face validity in the social sciences, that I was happy to see the people were less worried about mice because that fits with our intuitions. And people are less supportive of this sort of research, okay, than they were, and I will show you why in a few minutes. So, let me turn to the ethical debate. Let me turn to the professional ethical debate. Why are these controversial? And let's start with the bioethicists who I'm using to sort of compare everything to. So the first media stories quote bioethicists who state their concerns that organoids and chimeras will become human, okay? Now, no one in the mainstream debate thinks an organoid or mouse could become a biological human, but the biological distinction between species is not relevant in mainstream bioethical debate. What is at question is whether a mouse, for example, could obtain the moral definition of humanity and thus obtain human status, again from the perspective of contemporary bioethics. In this ethics, they would then be human, not physically, but morally. And this reflects one of the assumptions of bioethics, which is their theory of what a human is. So again, this is the anthropology, which is a human is an entity which has certain capacities. Most technically, the question is whether an entity obtains personhood is the terminology that's used here instead of humanity, because it's really just a moral theory of status, not bodily form. Okay. So in this perspective, for some biological humans, like those in permanent comatose states, don't have certain capacities and therefore would no longer be considered persons. And then the bioethics perspective would be that they can then no longer live. So anyone who signed an advanced medical directive is familiar with this logic. You identify certain capacities that if you lack, you don't want to be kept alive anymore. Okay. Now, some animals, like chimpanzees, have a lot of these valued capacities, and thus people in this tradition would say they should be treated at least more like we treat humans, or perhaps equally to humans. Therefore, an organoid, to continue this line of argument, an organoid or a neurochimera would obtain moral status of a human if it obtained key capacities of a human, starting with consciousness. So, for example, in a news article describing a mouse that had human brain organoid implanted in it, bioethicist Hank Greeley stated that the question was whether you're creating something human-ish that you have to take seriously in terms of according to dignity and respect, and figuring out what that even means. Another bioethicist, talking about neurochimeric mice, states that if we give them human cerebral organoids, what does that do to their intelligence, their level of consciousness, even their species identity? The article continues that, quote, the animals might become too human due to these human brain components. Greeley and his colleagues set the standard of whether you could transform a mouse into a man by whether it was, quote, a creature with some aspects of human consciousness or some distinctively human cognitive abilities. Similarly, Chen and colleagues write, one of the primary concerns centers on the possibility that animals transplanted with human brain organoids will become more human. Their ethical concerns with organoids are due to their being increasingly similar to the human brain, the source of higher order cognitive capacities that are often most equated with being human. This is a marker of a certain theory of the human that is dominant in secular bioethics. So from the perspective of the bioethical debate that typically influences what actually happens, this is primarily or really the only ethical question, again, due to the assumptions that bioethicists and scientists in the field have about what's important. Let me just quickly, what started me on this is I was on this government commission, pseudo-governmental commission about this, and they give you a charge of questions to ask. And this was our charge, and you will notice that the one is basically all about whether or not such entities would gain consciousness, and there was not a concern with anything else. So, my point is that, again, the mainstream ethical debate, that's what's at stake. Would one of these things obtain human-ish consciousness, be it an organoid or a neurochimeric animal? Now, what is consciousness? I am not going to tell you, okay? I know enough to recognize one of the biggest academic morasses when I see it. You could clearly spend your entire life studying this. I have no qualifications to engage in it. But people in the bioethical debate recognize that operationalizing consciousness into policy is going to be difficult, to say the least. But, so that's what bioethicists believe is the moral problem. What about the public? Okay, I will just tell you from a previous study, I showed that the public uses a different definition of the human than do bioethicists. My present project here contains many analyses, and I'll just use a few exemplars to give you a sense of how I'm making these claims. So let's look at the survey. After the organoid vignette, I ask whether they approve of the research, right? I also ask whether the research is done, the organoids could be destroyed, which is an indicator of moral status, okay? So in the bioethical arguments, more consciousness means more moral status. Okay, that's the logic of that. So the question is, did the people who were randomly selected to see different vignettes have different responses to these questions? And those on the left are the 4 different versions that people were selected to see. Quarter said this will not obtain consciousness. A quarter said it will obtain the consciousness of an insect. A quarter saw a pig, and the final quarter said human fetus. I was going to say human, but I just think that's so implausible that you have to have some validity to make people answer questions like this. So I couldn't really do that one. So of the people who saw, the 25% randomly selected to see no consciousness, okay, 69.5% approve of the research or strongly approve, and 54% say it's okay for the organoid to be destroyed. But if you read down, those numbers are essentially the same, or as we say in the business, they're statistically significantly the same, okay? So therefore, there is no difference in people's response to different levels of consciousness with an organoids. In other words, that is not their concern. Okay. So again, it's critical that each respondent didn't see any other description of consciousness. Because if you did 4 separate survey questions, people would say, oh, I get what they're at. They really want to know whether or not there's a difference. And the fact that they're asking me this 4 different questions means the proper answer is to say that more consciousness has more value. But I'm not giving them an opportunity to figure out what I want. And when you don't give them the opportunity to tip your cards towards them, there's no difference. Okay. All right, let's turn to neurochimeras. So after that neurochimera vignette, I asked, we should treat these, and then humanized, there was humanized mice or monkeys, or should we treat them better than we treat other mice or monkeys, depending on what they saw, okay? This gets at the moral status of the entity, okay? Would people give the entity more moral status so I describe it in different ways? Then you're assessing what's really important to them. So these are the 3 ways that was described the change in the animal, okay? One is the human immune system. This is the sort of base condition. It's not about the brain at all. These currently exist. One is brain tissue from a human, like a human. Let me skip over the difference and that's a complicated part of the book. I refer you to my 85 cents profit from each book if you want to get into that. But those are basically whether or not it's the brain, it's a comparison of the brain or the immune system. So again, randomly being selected to see basically either a neural chimera or a non-neural chimera, these numbers are the same. It doesn't impact what they think of the moral status. So the possibility of human consciousness is not particularly relevant for the public. It is and the reason for this is, which I don't have time to get into, but that the public doesn't use the same theory of a human as the ethicists do. Okay, so that's the difference here. Okay, let me turn to, come back to chimeras, or to chimeras. The primary concern is different for the public with organoids and chimeras. So when social scientists hear of a chimera, their thoughts do not turn to consciousness. Knowledge of Western cultures would suggest that the public's main concern will be on a foundational divide between humans and animals. So let me explain this. Societies have foundational cultural distinctions that are so deeply assumed that they're difficult for the members of society to even see. These differ by society, but in the contemporary West, some basic distinctions have been man-woman, mind-body, nature-culture, human-object, human-animal, okay? So this is a summary of Mary Douglas, very famous cultural anthropologist. Modern societies comprise many subcultures that are distinguished by the use of different cultural presuppositions. Despite these differences, some central pairs of categories are widely shared, for example, man-woman, nature-culture, etc. So one way to recognize something that violates a foundational distinction is that it's the subject of fear, disgust, or fascination. Key here is fear. In anthropological terms, something that violates a distinction is impure, unclean, and has taboos around it. At its extreme, it must be destroyed in order to maintain the distinction. Now, many people in the West think that they lack such distinctions, but the most influential anthropologists in this area wanted to show that these are equally prevalent in the West as they are in primitive societies. They're just different, okay? Now, popular culture plays with these foundational distinctions because they elicit a reaction. They really get people going. They reflect the deepest ideas in our culture. So let's look at a few versions in popular culture to see how this works. So what's this thing on the left? That's a plastinate. That is a human body with the skin removed, encased in plastic. This violates this inside-outside distinction. If you're a surgeon, one of the points of medical school is to get you to get over this inside-outside distinction, or you can't be a surgeon, okay? There's these studies that show the point of the anatomy lab is to get you used to the idea of going through the skin to do this distinction. And then, of course, our friend on the right there is the zombie who violates the living dead distinction. Our friend Dr. Frankenstein's monster, also violating the living dead distinction. This is why it's been such an object of fascination, and importantly, why the villagers tried to kill it. So the human-animal distinction is also foundational. I'm looking around the room, and I think there's going to be a few people who had, unfortunately, were watching television during this very unfortunate time who know who that person on the right is. The most famous neurochimera of all, that's Mr. Ed. And that's his friend Wilbur. These are repeatedly used in culture, again, because they work, okay? And they're so ground into our consciousness that we can't really even escape. I'll give you a final experiment. So what do we think that is? If you had a yuck response, this is an artist's rendition of a humanized pig, and it's violating the human-animal distinction, and most people get this kind of like, ugh, response. That means you have the human-animal distinction in your head, and it's giving you a slight sense of disgust. Now, you can train yourself to not have this. Studies have shown that people who are in biology and things, areas like that, bioengineering, they've trained themselves to not have this distinction. But regular folks don't. They do have this distinction. Okay, so I'm not the first person to point out that this is important for the public. Just to give you a quote from Robert and Bayless. I'll let you read that while I make sure I know where I am. Okay. So, a critical moral problem for these critics is that neurochimeras violate the boundary between humans and animals. And is that true for the public? Well, I can't have a survey that's just vignettes, or this survey would be longer than like a Dostoevsky novel. So some of my questions are like normal survey questions, okay? So I had one question which was, in general, humans are more similar to animals than they are different. So this is a measure of whether or not you believe that there is a sort of a divide between humans and animals. The chart shows the percent of those who most see a human-animal divide who approve of neurochimeric research, and the next row, those who at least agree with the divide. So what we see here is that those who most agree with the human-animal divide are much less approving of neurochimeric research than those who do not see a strong divide. Okay? This suggests that this is what's driving public concern. Similarly, it is those who do not see a foundational divide who want to treat the chimera better, that see it as it can be upgraded through addition of human qualities. Those who see a foundational divide are more likely to think that a mouse should always be treated like a mouse, no matter what you add to it. And this effect here, 17 and 27, actually is, somewhat small, but is, as we say in the business, statistically significant. So, one final bit on this. In the neurochimeric vignette, 1/3 of the respondents saw each of these three possible terms to describe a neurochimera. Now, some of you are asking, what is a CBIR? A CBIR is a term that I invented, okay? And the reason I invented it was it would be neutral with no baggage at all, okay? It's just a term, versus humanized, which has the baggage of the word human in it. And chimera, this was a response to one of my fellow commissioners who insisted that the public was going to be so disgusted by chimeras because they're thinking of chimeras from ancient mythology. And I'm telling them, like, no American knows any ancient, you do, because you have a PhD, but no one else does. So anyway, this one's for him. But anyway, that's my main point. So the question again, did people who see different titles for this thing approve of research different amounts? So the one that gets the least approval is the one that says humanized. The one that gets the most is the one that's neutral, okay? So when it has no baggage, you get the most approval. Humanized is reminding the respondent that this has partly human parts, okay? And therefore generating this negative response against it. So to sum up this section, members of the public who see a foundational divide between humans and animals are more likely to oppose neurochimeric research. Since a very large fraction of the public believes in such a divide, this is one of the explanations of public opposition. So I'm getting towards the end here. Let's turn to the public's views of organoids. In bioethical and scientific debate, disembodied human tissue has no moral status. If you had a tumor removed from your body, the surgeon would put it in a waste bin of some sort, and it would be not treated as sacred in any way, and it would be burned as medical waste. Now, when medical sociologists and anthropologists hear about something like an organoid, they think of something besides consciousness. Sociological and anthropological studies show that the public does not view disembodied human parts as fully alienated from the human that they came from. Studies show a good portion of the public thinks a human retains a connection. For example, sociologists asked blood donors if they thought their blood was still theirs after the donation. Half the sample had this sort of disconnected view, which was that it was alienable. Others believed in a continuity of possession. One respondent said, the blood would always be mine, it will always stay my blood, kind of like a loan. Other respondents saw the link as kind of between parent and child, saying it's like my children. They may grow up and be their own person, but still my child. This is more like a property relation or something like this. The strong version of the relationship is almost communicative. For this group, blood was the bearer of personality or moral disposition that would be transmitted to the recipient. Similarly, in the study of tissue donation, researchers found one category of resistance to it being that biospecimens are an extension of the self and require special care and respect. For those who talk this way, the physical nature of biospecimen retain an individual's essence. As one of the respondents said, "I feel more uncomfortable with giving a biological specimen because it feels like an attachment or extension of myself." So classically, the strongest version of this social phenomena comes, phone keeps talking to me, sorry, comes from the idea of the transferal of the self of the dead person via transplanted organs. In a classic study, authors found that recipients seem to share the belief that some of the psychic and social as well as physical qualities of the donor are transferred with his or her organ into the person to whom it's implanted, as if it were a repository and emanation of the donor's quintessence. Jill Haddow summarized this literature as claiming that changes in gender or behavior, resurgence of youth, or discovering new tastes and preferences are often attributed by transplant recipients to the act of taking an organ from one person and transplanting it into another. And other studies show essentially the same thing. So, an organoid is grown from the skin cells of an existing human. It's disembodied human tissue, like an organ. So from a scientific perspective, this is a 4 millimeter lump of human tissue in a dish. But these other studies suggest that those who make this ephemeral connection to disembodied tissue may be more opposed to organoid research. So after the organoid vignette, I asked the respondent to evaluate should human brain organoids should be thought of as an extension of the person who donated the skin cells used to make it. So the public more agrees with this than disagree with it, suggesting the public feels that there retains this connection between the donor of the cells and the organoid. I also asked about the strongest version of this connection, inspired by the studies of organ recipients. I asked, if a human brain organoid could think, it might have the thoughts of the person who donated the stem cells. Now, obviously, this is scientifically ridiculous, okay? But that doesn't matter, okay? As I often say, when it comes to the public acting, the truth of the matter doesn't matter. Public acts on what it perceives to be true, not on what is true, okay? And so you get a similar response, okay? Just a little bit more support than the previous one. So this is important to be said, that the people here, could be told or convinced that organoids do not have thoughts of the person who donated the cells. And the reason is people only know how much I told them in the survey, okay? But the main point is that upon hearing about this for the first time, their first instinct is to think, oh, yeah, if it could have thoughts, it would be connected to this person in such a powerful way. So again, to tie this back together, does this viewing of an ephemeral connection with an organoid determine what we think about the research or about the status of it? So the comparison on the left is with agreeing or disagreeing that an organoid is an extension, and agreeing or disagreeing that it has the thoughts of the donor. So here you see, thinking that organoids could have the thoughts of the cell donor, there at the bottom, is associated with not wanting the organoids to be destroyed, okay? And at the top, you see that thinking as an extension is also strongly associated. Then, to tie this together, we can see, and this is going to point to this table here, they're going to think of the methodological question here, but this difference between 68 and 4 is not an artifact of the data. It has been checked a kabillion times. The point being that people who think of these ephemeral connections, who are randomly assigned to see different these vignettes, they are, the more you think there's ephemeral connections, the more status you're willing to give to organoids, to organoids. Okay. Now again, we can say the public doesn't understand human biology. Totally true, okay? But totally irrelevant, because in a liberal democratic society, it is the public who sets the directions of things. Is it better if the public knows what is scientifically true? Absolutely. But this gives you a sense of what the response will be, and it's not just driven by the facts of biology, but it's driven by a different moral orientation. And again, to be clear, the public are not absolutists. There's no one who says, for example, that an organoid is a human. Okay, you didn't encounter any of that. It's more like a shading, a concern, a disquiet that people have. Okay, so let me just do one little extension here. Many people in bioethics have heard of a book called The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. This was a woman, poor woman in Baltimore in the 1950s who had this tumor removed, and against her knowledge, or no one asked her or anything, this was cultured and replicated and sold to labs around the world for decades as the HeLa cell line. And HeLa stands for Henrietta Lacks, okay? And this book about Henrietta Lacks is often told as a lesson about biomedical research, racism, and inequality in that particular era. But there's another lesson in the book for people, which is that Henrietta Lacks' family embodies this concern with ephemeral connections. The book's author reports that Lacks' daughter found that scientists had been using the HeLa cells to study viruses. She imagined her mother eternally suffering the symptoms of each disease. In another scene in the book, family members are shown a freezer full of HeLa cells. One of Lacks' children says, "I can't believe that all that's my mother." When handed a vial of the frozen cells, one daughter says, "She's cold." Okay? And looking through a microscope says, "That's my mother." No one seems to get that. So when I read the documents on organoid, there's a new proposal out there on organoid computing, which is you take all these organoids, you put electrical leads underneath them, you connect them to a mechanical electrical computer, and you can use the organoid, the biological human brain components, to somehow generate a better computer. Does that work? Who knows? But I'll simply say that I think the public is supportive of organoid research when the countervailing force is people dying from Parkinson's disease. If the countervailing force is we want to have a faster computer so that we have faster artificial intelligence, I don't think that's a very powerful reason to do it for the public, at least. Okay. Conclusions. I've summarized this ethical debate about organoids and neurochimeric animals. First, for the academic bioethicist, the most important consideration is whether either could obtain enough consciousness to warrant different treatment or extremely treatment like a human. My survey suggests that possible consciousness is not very important for the public. Secondly, the public tends to adhere to a foundational distinction between humans and animals that academics have largely learned not to be concerned with. The survey suggests that this divide is important as a reason for opposition to neurochimeric animals. And thirdly, the public sees possible connections between disembodied human parts and actual humans. The connection gives a degree of reluctance to organoid research. The public is also concerned with people suffering from neurological disease and support research that will reduce this suffering. Thus, we have an ethical dilemma. But as this research goes forward, we need to be aware of the reasons for the public's ethical concern so that research can advance in a way most consistent with the public's ethics. And with that, I'll stop and answer any questions that you have. So I'll start right here.
Draw the conclusion that consciousness doesn't matter very much in public attitudes.
Yeah.
Don't you need an answer to a question? You may have it. To what extent does the public think a fetus is conscious? Suppose they didn't.
Right.
Then it would, your conclusion would not be supported, it seems, right?
Yes. So and I think I'm not sure I have such data, and I didn't gather such data, but that's an important test. I'm going to guess and say that the public doesn't think that. But no, that is a useful comparison that I don't have. And for the next version, I'll do that one. Yes?
I have a question about your vignettes.
Yes.
And a way in which it looks to me like some of the public misperceptions that you're talking about at the end seem baked into those vignettes. So the first vignette, if I understood it, right, asks or identifies what's going on as either a 2 or a 5-inch part of a human brain.
Yeah.
Right? And there's just no sense in which that's true, it seems to me.
Well,
right? It's not part of a human brain.
Right.
It's not even a thing that, if integrated into a human brain, could become a part without significant adjustments. But the natural reading of it is you've taken a little bit of brain out. And,
Right.
right? And then the second one, brain tissue from a human,
Right.
right, also looks like you've extracted tissue from
Right.
a person's brain. And both of those make it seem much more like you have this like alienated bit of a person,
Right.
as opposed to something that's, derivative by way of a lot of technological manipulation on biological materials.
Right.
Should that make a difference?
Yeah, so you're essentially saying that some of the people were randomly selected to see versions of this that were more like removals from an existing human, and other people saw it as not that way. And so, yeah, I thought about that while doing this. Part of the constraint, of course, is that you can't use too many words in these things, or people can't answer them because they don't remember it all in their head before they're supposed to answer. But one of the ways I dealt with this is that one of the things that they were randomly assigned to see was that they were grown, that these were grown. And so they weren't taken, they were sort of grown in this dish. And there's no difference between people who saw either one of those. The other is, one of the reasons I have the like a human brain and from a human brain was to see if that makes a difference, and that actually doesn't make a difference. Yeah, I mean, the other thing I was going to say, which I thought you were going to mention, is that there are no 5-inch brain organoids, okay? Which falls into the category you have to ask people sort of extreme things to get their reactions. And the challenge to that would be, are people, if I would have kept it at something that's plausible within the next 5 years, like 1 inch, okay, am I biasing the results by showing that 5-inch thing? And the answer is, when I run the data, I have a very large N for this, so I can sub-segment it like this. When I run it just on the ones with the more plausible size, I get the same results. Great question. These sociologists here didn't even come up with the killer methodological question. Shame on you. Okay, other questions? Oh, here we go.
So John, I'm interested in why you think the public has these views, and I suppose one way of thinking about it is that when an average person thinks about what it means to be human, they think in spiritual, not just physical terms. So that might be one thing, I suppose. And another thing might be that the average person is influenced by what creates society and what maintains it, where most of us as PhDs think maybe more in our heads,
Right.
and are not thinking about, well, how important, what are these categorical distinctions important for? Part of it is to make society possible, right? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, let me start with the first one, which is that my explanation for why the public believes in these ephemeral connections is that they're not materialists. So I think, how would I put this? At least I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but I have tenure, so I'm okay. At least in institutional training programs in science, teach people to be materialists. How's that sound? And so there is nothing besides matter would be the dominant form. And then bioethics is essentially a derivative of science in that regard. But the public, of whom, I think I did a survey on this, it's like 75% believe you have a soul. People obviously believe in communication with God, other communication with others, etc. So that you have a soul that departs, goes to heaven. All of these non-material, ephemeral connections the public believes in, and so it's not a very big leap to go from that to think, oh, there's a disembodied connection between a human and its parts. And again, like, I think if there was a public relations campaign by people who want to promote organoids to convince people that that's not the case, it would, people would eventually learn that, but that's people's first response. And then, these foundational distinctions sort of are how culture needs to exist, right? You have these things out there, and I think that that's just a question of which ones that people have. The human-animal one is surprisingly dominant. In another study I did about what people think a human is, the main distinction between all of the public's versions of anthropologies is they all retain some notion of human distinctiveness. So like even the biological one, where there's a sort of a genetic continuum between, amoebas and humans, people will sort of acknowledge this continuum, but there's like a hinge in the data at humans, okay? So that's sort of standard of the public, that biologists tend to at least underemphasize that and emphasize the continuity. So I hope that answers your question. Yes?
Is there any consistency to the idea of a standard human that excludes the PhDs in the other end?
Yeah.
Or who is the standard human or the average human?
Yeah, like on opinions? Yeah, so I think I would probably just mostly say there is no standard human, but there is a standard human if I can be abstract and vague enough, right? The things that we would all agree upon become so vapid that they don't really tell you much. So most of what sociologists do is they say, well, let's break this population into 4 groups, and then I can make generalizations about those 4 groups. So let's do education, which is you're referring to and is a common one for sociologists to be concerned with. I could say, as a generalization, people with PhDs tend to think like this, with undergraduate degrees think like this, etc. But that in itself is a statement about the mean with a variation around it, okay? So I think empirically, when you want to make a statement about what everyone thinks, it unfortunately has to be beyond general. So in ethics, I write a lot about ethics, and I'm very concerned with ethical principles that the public might hold in consensus. And the one I do believe is, I'm sure there's someone who doesn't agree with this, but almost universally, it is better to do good than to do harm.
But you don't exclude the PhDs.
I don't exclude the PhDs from that, no. And I feel safe saying that since I have one of those PhDs I can pick on myself. And the most extreme, I should add, on all sorts of value things, are not people with PhDs in science, they're people with PhDs in social science and humanities. Well documented. Okay, great question. You got another one? Oh, we're running out of time. I talk a lot. So.
Friends, please join me in thanking Professor Evans.